Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon to Jacqueline, who I'm speaking with today, who is on the west coast of Australia. I have great affinity for the west coast of Australia because my daughter lives over that way and my two little grandbabies. So we're gonna have a little chat again. But this time it's going to be a bit more focused around you. And
Interesting.
rather than me introducing you formally, I'm going to allow you the pleasure of introducing yourself because I think we can talk about ourselves much better than others can for us, often, perhaps not always. So tell us a little about where you began professionally, because you are an ethicist now.
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up here in Perth in what we call Bolu Wajak country. Unbeknownst to me, growing up as a really kind of very white Australian, growing up in what we call the Swan Valley here, I was growing up very close in my young days to some really significant sites from Wajak history and colonial history. So that's something, teaching and thinking about ethics that I've come to navigate through as well. What are these kind of things that were unseen at the time that we come to see? And so I grew up here in Perth in Western Australia, and I started my academic career in the philosophy department here at the University of WA here in Perth, where I started to research, well, originally some really interesting things around the philosophy of time and the nature of mental causation. And then in between that, I had some years of experience working in industry and came into management roles and really, I think, really got very interested in the ethics of leadership, on the power of leadership, what leadership looks like, and really got interested in the crossover of those two things. So I went back to the philosophy department at UWA to do my PhD in leadership and ethics, thinking about the ethics of leadership and thinking about all of the narratives that we put leadership to, all of the ways that we dress power up as leadership, or that we overcome or overlook some of the ethical questions by calling things leadership, or that we overlook the important benefits of leadership. And then I found myself here in the business school at Curtin University, where I'm now the curriculum lead in our Centre for Applied Ethics. So I had a few years teaching and talking about ethics with MBA students and our Bachelor of Commerce students from a business perspective and from a leadership perspective. And now I get to have a lot of really good conversations with our teaching staff and with industry people around ethics in general, applied ethics, but increasingly the ethical and responsible use of artificial intelligence, which is a whole new emerging area, which also crosses over, I think, with the ethics of leadership and management too. So yeah, that's me.
Absolutely. I'm going to track back a little bit. Um, at the Coaching Ethics Forum conference in 2025 in December, it was extraordinarily more powerful than I even envisaged, even though I put the conference together. And we had Indigenous voices from all over the world, including two Indigenous from Australia. And that was such a profound experience hearing those two in particular and the message they had to give for a white Australian. To hear what they said was just so inviting for us all to be there. As a white Australian, as the Indigenous voice has grown stronger and louder, and it should never have been lost, in fact, in my view. But there's always this, as that's happened, the language has become more us and them, even more so. It's not really joined in to be one voice.
Mm,
And I realized through some of the welcome of one of the Indigenous in that conference that unfortunately, but given history, but thankfully for the courage and the compassion of this person, that for the first time I heard an Indigenous person give the welcome that included the white Australians.
Wow. Yeah.
It was extraordinarily powerful. I
Mm,
actually, every time I sit and reflect and think about that, and even talking about that now, it's so emotive for me. I have
mm,
to manage myself because it was just huge. And I thought for an Australian to hear that and the impact it had on me, I just thought, imagine the community of Australia if they were all to hear that again and again and again.
yeah.
Also, I think other Indigenous populations around the world, the same message needs to be heard. And it kind of, in some ways, that had me realize that lands on the Indigenous peoples to say, you are welcome here, even,
Mm.
even though everything has happened. Um, so I'm interested to know more, given that little experience of mine, more about what you've learnt from your experience of where you are.
Yeah, I think that's such an enormous question, and I feel like I don't have a particularly profound answer in part because my answer is that I'm always trying to remind myself or stay in this space where what I'm doing is talking about ethics from a Western philosophical point of view on contested lands where we still have, I think for me, when I think about like the moral compact or the kind of ethical underpinnings of our society, to me it seems we're still working through, I think, one of the most open-hearted, kind of gracious statements, poetic statements that I've come across in Australian history was the Uluru Statement from the Heart, right? That kind of statement of coming together after a struggle, this profound concept, and this profoundly generous, open-hearted invitation or extending of a hand to construct what does Australia look like, um, I can't say post-colonization, but post that statement, right? And so I think for a lot of us, there's a real struggle, even before the vote around the voice, there's a real struggle with the fact that that conversation seems to be shut down. And so this kind of profound, like, what is this underlying structure that morally, ethically, ideologically justifies this community that we have on this land is still, I suppose, not being had. And I think, people far more articulate than me will explain that in better ways. But for me personally, it does mean that I'm always inviting people into conversations about ethics and dialogues about ethics on land where we still struggle to acknowledge tens of thousands of years of doing that, of talking about ethics, and also more recently in ongoing profound moral wrongs and disconnects. So it's always, I think, a space of tension. It's not easily resolved.
Lots of professions have different codes, and thinking about my own, the Australian Psychological Code of Ethics, and of course, coaching has its own voluntary codes of ethics, and people are often saying, but they're all through the Western lens. And I've been thinking about that recently as I'm about to land some new work at the Coaching
Mm.
Ethics Forum. And I'm thinking, so what does a code of ethics look like then if the current ones are based on Western thinking? So, what does a code of ethics look like that allows that diversity of culture? And I wonder if it's just about the wording. It's not about the way of being, but it's about the wording that they're using. It's some of my thinking at the moment.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think, yeah, for me, what you're touching on there, which is really profound and important, is I think constantly in philosophical ethics, we have this, and political thinking, we have this attempt to get down to um, the leanest, most minimal possible concepts so that we can allow space for people to fill in those structures with their own ethics, or for us to fill in that structure with due respect for what someone else values ethically. And I think maybe, over the past 100 years, the story of ethical and political philosophy, often the story is that we still haven't reached that bedrock, that we still often have those assumptions built in. So something like a Western liberal tradition, which has a nod at pluralistic approaches, so people can choose their own definitions of a well-lived life. We still probably haven't reached that bedrock. They're not ideologically neutral. And I'm not sure if that's because there is no such bedrock, there's always values baked in, or if it's because we haven't got there yet, we haven't found a way that can accommodate those. But we do, I think, and especially, when I think when we're talking with students, when we're talking with anyone about ethics, members of the public, it should always be a good dialogue. I think that is always important to have in the mix. What assumptions am I bringing here? And the answer, I think, is not to throw them out. There are things that, which are common assumptions, which we hold true or which we all share and value, but it's at least to be aware of them.
I'm always fascinated by people who are talking about ethics like we are today, and assumptions arise or bias arise. And I like to push back a little bit on that because it can have people think that if we're just digging into our assumptions and digging into our biases, then we are engaging in ethical thinking and potentially ethical practice. And I don't know
Mm,
that that's the case. I think there's much more that involved in bringing a full ethical awareness, to be engaging in the ethical thinking needed, um, than just looking at our assumptions and biases. Would you have a comment
mm.
on that?
I do, and I think that's yes, I think there's something really valuable in that. I've been having a lot of conversations recently about separately from the individual courses here at Curtin, what do we want our graduates to take as they go out into the world as well-formed, critical thinking, switched on, smart, enthusiastic people? What are I think all universities have this, the idea of graduate attributes and graduate capabilities. And one of the things that I have to acknowledge is really profoundly well done in the Curtin ones is that the ethical element is really inextricable and always comes packaged with critical thinking. So even our definition of ethics in our curriculum is often reasoning about right and wrong. And I think it brings out what you're describing there, which is, sometimes when we first start talking with ethics, about ethics with people, it either reduces to just values or exactly, in philosophy, we would call what you're describing ethical intuition. So when I look at a situation, and we often explain to students, okay, this is a starting point. You will look at a scenario and you will often have a strong, a gut feeling or a reaction. What's really fun is you can often picture it on students' faces if it's one of disgust or one of like approval. That's an interesting starting point. That's a way into a conversation. Why do I think that this is profoundly morally wrong? And you maybe think it's fine, or vice versa. Why are we not lining up there? Great, that's interesting. That's a fun way in. But then what we need to do, and really where we have the value and where we know we're doing good ethics, is how do I examine those assumptions? What reasoning do I need to do? What higher level commitments do I have? And I always say to my students, what I want them to have is not one right answer to ethics, but I
Mm,
want them to have an internally consistent, well thought out set of answers to the big, important ethical questions in life so
mm.
that they can articulate it to themselves and also they can share that with other people and come to dialogues and discussions with other people about what makes things right or wrong, what's important to them. How do we navigate these things together, right? Otherwise, we just, as you say, we just have the ethical intuitions, and really all that lends itself to is, in the worst case, yelling at each other online, or absolute best case scenario, all it leads to is, I think this is wrong, you think it's right. Oh, that's interesting. Like there's no discussion from there, and it doesn't help me improve my own ethical thinking too. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to see people take it the extra step. They have the pathway. So I'm in a coaching mindset now. They
Oh, interesting. Yep.
identify all the pathways of potential action, and then choose a course of action and have a clear
Mm,
rationale for that course of action, given the number of pathways that they've identified, and then
mm-hmm,
actually do it. What do we need? What
mm,
resources do we need to actually take the action? So
yeah.
you might be interested in my Courageous Becoming article on
Hmm.
the Journal of
I
Coaching
was
and
looking that up this morning, actually. Yeah. Yeah.
speak
I
to
think that's
that.
often the next step, right? How do we actually not just identify what we think is the right course of action, but how do we actually implement that and actually go out and share that with others, put it in
Yeah.
place, act, sell that as a course of action, what have you? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So we're moving on, and there's that word "so" again. For anyone who's listening, I'm trying to get rid of the word "so," and I'm realizing how often it lands in my speech in these conversations, and I'm not very happy about it. So I'm trying to change it. So let's look back a little bit. And what, in relation to your whole career, and you're young looking, I don't know, you don't need to
Well,
share how old you are, but I'm going to make a judgment here. You look very young for having such
like
a
that.
quite a long career, really, across different places. Let's think about your that whole span career, and even outside of career, perhaps there's something before work or outside of work that you feel you've had such a significant contribution to life, society, people,
You
persons
mean other, you mean contributions that I've received, things that have made a contribution to me?
that you have made yourself.
Oh, okay. I don't know why that's a harder question. Um, Interesting. I really hope that, when we're in a teaching role, we always really hope that we're offering something of use to our students. Um, yeah, I think that, that I think for those of us that are in that profession, but I also think as well, where I hope that I've made a contribution is really anyone younger around me. I was really struck when I first moved to a business school and I had a conversation with someone who was, bringing me into a role and said, okay, here's what we're going to do. We'll make sure we set you up for success. And that just struck me as such a generous, constructive, incredible vibe that I wanted to be around. It was such an amazing environment to create. And I think maybe that's a crossover with me for leadership when I've been around people who have really demonstrated leadership and have wanted to set me up for success. And so I hope that I really had that impact on other people in terms of anyone younger than me coming along in a career path. But also, I think, it means a lot to me in my life that I'm a pretty decent auntie. And I think it's been an absolute blessing to me that I have four beautiful nieces who are all of them almost all in their teenage years now. And we have some really good conversations and we spend some really good time together. And I think for me, what's been really exciting is being part of almost a generational shift where I think I see a kindness and an openness and a generosity in them. And I think if in some small part I have been a part of that generational shift towards a really kind of affirmative way of engaging with young people, um, telling them how wonderful they are, telling them what strengths they have, telling them how kind they are, just telling them how much I love them. Um, that I think has been really, really meaningful to me. Yeah, at a really deep personal level, I think.
Yeah, I imagine. I can equate that to me and my grandchildren now, actually. It's taken me on a whole other journey of adulthood, so
Mm-hmm.
which I absolutely adore. I want to
That's
move in.
that's yeah.
Sorry.
I think, yeah, and in a way, I think it doesn't compare being an auntie, but I think there's something lovely about the fact that you can be just purely in a support cheerleader relationship where there's never a time when you've had to worry about, paying someone's school fees or not seeing these little people as the most wonderful people who ever lived and not being the person who thinks, look, I understand that their parents have to shape their behavior, but I can just tell them they're fantastic because they are. They're wonderful. Yeah.
Exactly. Um, want to talk about some challenging times that, you can identify one perhaps and tell us that story. Um, I've skipped over the decision-making aspect because we've already touched on it earlier. So, can you identify a challenge that you've had? in your career. The stories that I've heard so far are diverse, often have involved some kind of loss, sometimes not. And I've been really surprised with people sharing those stories, keeping confidentiality in place. But they've been, I think, really useful stories as well for people to hear, because we often can feel like we're caught alone when we're having to walk challenges. I know I feel that way often, particularly in 2025. So I think it's really useful for people to hear that, lots of people walk challenge
Yeah.
walks and have to make really challenging decisions.
And I'm sure many people like me are sitting here right now thinking, well, which one do you pick from? Where do you pick from the whole list of, challenges that you've had? I think for me, I do remember a time really shortly before I left full-time employment in a sort of for-profit big organization. And I think really there's kind of sometimes an identity crisis almost that comes in times of, thinking what will the path be? But I know for me, how do I say this? I think for me, there have been times where I didn't maybe stand confidently or have a strong, clear sense of my own identity in terms of what skills and what value was I bringing to something. And I think for me, maybe it is hard to see what are the lines between that being an identity crisis versus being a valuing the skills and the disciplines. And in part, that might be because philosophy is such a non-vocational discipline. So there could be, a tendency um, to keep that quite separate from career aspirations. And I know, for example, when I first decided to start a PhD in philosophy, I had every intention in the world not to be an academic. I assured my partner, I don't want to be an academic. I'm not looking to work in a university. I would just like to do this for personal satisfaction. And he, bless him, was very supportive and smiled and made all the right motions of believing that of me. But I do remember a time shortly before I left full-time work in the private sector, where, my partner was working away a lot and I was in an environment which was not one where people's focus was setting other people up for success. There was behaviour that I think was just between us and the anonymous conversation, I think really qualified as workplace bullying. I think there were people who felt very insecure in their own roles and really sort of punched down to a certain extent, and were creating an environment where people were really unsure, where the definition, I'd come out of an environment before that where the definition of success was very clear. People treated each other with respect. There were it's not that there weren't hidden agendas. More than that, there was a really clear team program. Here's what we're trying to achieve. Here's a clear, transparent definition of success. And we had a really clear sense of how people could contribute to that. So to find myself in an environment where that wasn't the case and where the definition of success wasn't clear and where there were people who were feeling really insecure. And I think it's the only time in my life where I felt genuinely miserable and unhappy in my work. So my partner was working away, and it's the only time in my life, as I say, where I'd get home, I would lock the door. I remember I'd change into my pajamas at sort of 4:35 in the afternoon. As soon as I got home, I would eat far too many potato chips, watch some really lowbrow TV, and really just kind of hole up and recover at home. And I remember realizing that this was just not a healthy way to be. And I think what made me realize that was that this was making me miserable, and that even if I were to somehow change things and somehow become much more successful in this job, I realized that even on a best case scenario, it would be using my skills and talents and abilities such that they were using my efforts and energy towards something that I just really didn't care about. So sometimes when you're working in a large organization that doesn't necessarily have a purpose that connects with you, the most that you can hope for is that all of your 50-hour-a-week efforts and energies can slightly increase one number on one report. And I remember realizing, see, I don't care about that. It's not a good use of my time and energy. And so I think that was quite freeing to escape that and to realize that that actually left a complete blank canvas. and it left leaving full-time employment to study philosophy full-time in a PhD with absolutely zero job opportunities. It made that a really real option, which was an absolute blessing in the end. Yeah.
That's the interesting thing about philosophy. It is just such a hard gig to get in the academic sense. Uh,
Especially if you're not willing to move anywhere else in the world. So even if you're
mm,
just willing to move across the planet, I think at the drop of a hat at a job acceptance, philosophy is still really slim pickings. Um, but my partner's career at the time was absolutely wedded to Perth. So if you're not in a position to move, yeah, yeah. So I think it means that you need to, I'm saying so a lot. It does, I think, mean that you need to be kind of flexible and open to, for me, for example, moving into a business school, it first felt like, is that really what I want to do? It's not a job in a philosophy department, but it's been a real blessing in terms of the kind of flexibility and the kind of blank canvas that you have sometimes to create your own unique role. What does it look like to be a moral philosopher working in a business school and now a Centre for Applied Ethics? Like, what can I do there that's fun and creative and is kind of a little bit unique to me? Yeah.
it's a courageous story.
I don't know if it's courageous. It's
And your
sometimes
partner's
things
still with
sometimes it feels like you create that after the fact, right? You kind of
you.
find yourself somewhere and you think, how can I make the best of it or create something here which will be engaging and maybe offer a bit of value? Yeah.
Mhm. But it's walking away from something that had certain degree of stability, and you had stable income, you had a place to go to, which is a purposeful place, even if you
Mm,
didn't align with you. You had known things to be doing, to then walking into another purpose, studying a PhD, the partner still with you,
hmm.
and
Yeah.
and not knowing what the outcome would be from that enormous work. So that's fairly courageous, I would imagine. Um, well, not imagine. I
Yeah.
can. I think that we don't give ourselves enough kudos for those leaps that we take.
I mean, sometimes I think it helps if you feel like you don't always have infinite options, right? If you're sometimes it helps to have that push away from a job that is really not nourishing you, where you're not thriving. Sometimes it helps to have that motivation, that push factor.
Hmm. It's interesting that philosophy, the word itself, comes up a lot when we're talking about ethics. Can we separate them? Can we be engaging in ethical inquiry and action without philosophy?
Look, I think it's an interesting question. And look, I think there's the technical answer, right? There's the technical answer, which I always like to remind my philosophical colleagues that philosophy starts with ethics. The founding question of Western philosophy is how should one live? What is a good life? And but I think my answer to that is that actually we're all kind of natural philosophers and we all find ourselves, whether it's over a coffee or with a good friend or after a few drinks at the pub, we all find ourselves having these conversations which are, I think, deeply philosophical and deeply philosophical in what we're wondering about, how we approach and engage other people. I've never come across someone who doesn't think, what's the purpose of life? What is a good, flourishing life? What kind of life do I want for my children or grandchildren or nieces and nephews? Um, yeah, and so I think we're all deeply philosophical. All that philosophy does, formal training in philosophy, is it gives you a bunch of tools that you can use to explore those questions and that you can use to do really good critical thinking. Like, what do I have good grounds for thinking is true? So it gives you this great toolkit of ways to explore those well with other people in a constructive, collegial, um, productive way. But yeah, I think we're all natural philosophers, and I think we all care deeply about ethics, about questions of fairness, and about questions of justice. Yeah.
So we could almost drop the word ethics because it's just an umbrella term for a whole bunch of other things that we navigate and think about.
I think we could, and I think sometimes ethics can sound so abstract and remote and a little bit intimidating. And I think increasingly over the past, say, 18 months when I've been doing this role, thinking about how do we create spaces for conversations about ethics between our teaching staff and our students, I do increasingly become sympathetic to the idea. I sometimes think of it, just don't call it ethics. Because often I talk with people who say, oh, I'm not sure that I have anything to say about ethics, but gee, I really care about privacy or fairness or safety, or, well, I really care about the environmental impact of artificial intelligence. So there are these elements of ethics that I think really meet us where we are and that really speak to us. And so, to a certain extent, do we lose much if we don't call it ethics? I think, I'm really here to have conversations about things that matter to us. Whatever we call it. Yeah.
You mentioned that you were reading my paper, The Courageous Becoming, Pathways to Ethicality, just to land that word there. What are your thoughts about the word ethicality, given what we've just said about ethics?
Ooh, it's interesting. Now, look, full disclosure, I do have to say I haven't read all of the paper yet, so I'm likely to say something really dumb. Um, ooh, can I ask your sense of what the word ethicality, what it brings to the conversation for you?
Yeah, so it's the combination of that thinking and engaging and moving through the cycle to actually taking action. And in turn, then, you become something new from the process. So it encapsulates all of that. There's a new domain that I call developmental ethicality that I'm writing a paper on at the moment. I think it's because I'm a psychologist at heart, so I'm all in for developmental stuff of humans, and that's sort of where I'm sitting in.
Mm. I mean, it's such a rich concept, right? Because often some of the philosophical theories of ethics can be very focused on the rules and really the decision procedures. What are the decision procedures that allow someone to decide if an action is right or wrong, or in a new situation? Should I keep the promise, or should I keep the promise to meet someone for coffee or stop to help someone? And a lot of the Western lenses on ethics have been very, what's the decision procedure? And so often I see conversations about AI ethics in terms of, can we program in the right rules so that AI will come up with the right decision or the right outcome? But what that doesn't do is the much older, more ancient approaches to ethics, which really focus on the person and the character, and I guess that becoming is, what is it to become the kind of person who acts courageously, who acts honestly, who acts generously and kindly? And what is that development process to develop and foster human beings who do happen to have wisdom about knowing the right thing to do, and then do actually do it right, who do skillfully with some kind of grace, act generously, act courageously, act honestly, act kindly, right? And it's always really striking to me that these character-based theories of ethics, or what we call virtue ethics in philosophy, they're really the only traditions that have something to say about moral upbringing and how we foster and support very young people, children, to become morally competent adults. The other theories don't really have much to say about that. And so I find that really striking in an AI era. It does just seem undeniable to me that there's something about that lived experience, that embodied sense of what it is to look at you, recognize that you might be in need, have that motivate something in me, and then respond to that need in you as another human being, rather than running a kind of calculation of what the right thing to do would be in the abstract. Yeah.
It's curious about being abstract. I mean, I gave a webinar to Japan a week or so ago, and I just felt like I was becoming more abstract the longer I was talking. And I'm like, let's just land this somewhere concrete.
Mm.
And they loved the abstract. They would have been quite happy to sit there wading around in the abstract. And I go, yeah, but what does this look like though? Otherwise, we're just thinking, contemplating our navel and what words might mean. Like, what does it actually look like in real life? Because to move beyond the abstract to that absolute solid foundation of engaging in life in that way, I think is where the richness is.
Mm.
And so that's ethicality for me.
Yeah. Yeah, that really resonates with me. And I think there's that old joke that people make, there's nothing as practical as a good theory. But I think what we always want for our ethical conversations, I think, is this kind of harmony between what am I, to the extent that I have abstract theoretical commitments, and they're really useful sometimes at understanding the world and my own intuitions. How do they plug into my ethical values and commitments, and how do they plug into and harmonize, hopefully, with my actions? And sometimes I need that abstract approach to really take a look at my practical actions and think, well, I actually need to pull my socks up a bit, or I might need to do some moral work to improve myself to harmonize with those theoretical and mid-level commitments that I have. And sometimes it's the case that those kind of ethical intuitions and my actual responses to applied cases really need to reinform what I think are my theoretical commitments, right? Hopefully there's a harmony between those. But yeah, I agree. Like if you only leave things at the abstract, especially when it comes to something like ethics, then we're missing a lot of just richness. But also, if it's not leading us to action, then I think we're probably missing something there in ethics. Yeah, yeah.
Tell me about ethical intuitions for you. How do they show up? I have a sense that you're talking about a tension, that you sense a tension, you see it, or so how do you know that that ethical tuition has come alive for you?
Interesting. I think often it is quite bodily. It is when you have that strong, I think, reaction. And as I say, often when when we're teaching ethics, when we're having ethical dialogues with other people, philosophers like to use a lot of thought experiments or a lot of cases from the news. Imagine this or imagine that. So Rob Sparrow, an Australian philosopher, has a terrific conversation article about the question of whether it's okay to kick a robot dog. So a robot that looks and acts like a dog, if I'm angry, is it okay to kick it? And so I think that I know there's an ethical intuition because I've never been in that situation. I don't have a well-formed set of experience there. I didn't grow up with friends and family members and parents telling me what the right thing to do in that situation or wrong thing to do is. So in a way, I think that's when I know I'm in intuition territory because it's new, it's a thought experiment. But I think often it's quite bodily, right? It's that sense of, oh, I don't think I'm okay with that, or a kind of that kind of gut feeling whenever you have that initial response, which is disconnected from a kind of ongoing experience. And they can be really useful. I think, they have a really strong role to play in our ethical thinking and ethical dialogues. The only problem comes about when we think that we just leave it at the level of ethical intuitions and we can't have any kind of growth or progress from there. We can't revise those ethical intuitions.
So I'm just thinking about um, the tensions, and so I'm curious to know your thoughts are. I've often thought that the tensions can arise in different ways for different people. So you speak of it being a sensation, a gut level sensation, and that's directly linked to ethical intuition. I'm wondering if some people, in your view or experience, actually think it first or
Oh, interesting.
emotionally feel it first, as opposed to having a physical reaction in the body. If there are different ways that that ethical intuition is experienced by different people.
I think you're right. And I think when you put it that way, I think that does crystallize it well. I think really maybe the definition of that ethical intuition is that immediate reaction we have before we've thought before we've thought the matter through with any kind of reason. And of course, the danger is that sometimes what we do is we rationalize after the fact. We think, well, we come up with a reason for here's why my initial reaction and my initial intuition was brilliant and insightful. We rationalize it after the fact. But no, I think like anything that's that immediate reaction or where we haven't examined it, and often examining and thinking about our reasons for holding an ethical view really requires discussing it with other people, thinking through what other people think and why, like genuinely listening to their reasons. I think one of the most courageous things I often see, and I saw it last week with a fantastic group of undergraduate students where they had a discussion, they were, on different sides of a topic. And then at the end, one of them said, yeah, I did hear something that changed my mind. And he named the other student. He even pointed at her and said, when you said X, Y, Z at the end, that was a really good point. That won me over. So I think that's very open and very courageous, I think, especially for young people to
Mm-hmm.
in an open setting like that, to have the courage to say, yeah, that changed my mind for the following reasons. So
Mm-hmm.
I admire that. Yeah. It's
Yeah.
very motivating. It's very gratifying, I think, to see that
Yeah.
in that courage. Yeah.
Yeah. And motivating as well, I imagine. The gratification kind of fuels the motivation for a little more of that happening.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So putting ourselves 10, 20, I can do it 30 years in the future. What would you like your legacy to be known by?
Oh, wow.
You can do it.
That is a big question. I feel like I should have a better answer to that. Um, I think personally, I think it is the kind of stuff that I mentioned before, knowing that the people that I had the ability to do some good for, the people that who I had the ability to contribute to setting them up for success, I would really want them to know that I saw the best in them and that I approached them with a spirit of, I would hope, generosity and support. Um, and I hope that I would bring the same thing to those around me, whether it is students or colleagues. Yeah, I suppose I would hope that I find a way to bring out the best in them, to support them in what they're doing, to maybe help them, how do I say this in a non-corny way, to really help them see the best in themselves as well, and to really be a little bit aspirational. I think for me, coming from a very working class background, there was a moment, and I think maybe at all moments, it's very, very easy to be quite, maybe a little bit more limited than you might be, to be quite, to look for well-trodden paths, to look for things that are known, and your horizons can be a little smaller than they might otherwise be. So I think
Mhm.
the extent to which I can encourage people and give people confidence to really, I suppose in Australia we would say to back themselves, right? To have confidence in themselves and to really champion themselves and think about what a fun, fulfilling, creative life for them would be, and to do it in a way that is generous in how it supports other people.
Yeah, to break the walls of confinement according to societal set of rules, whether that's you're
Yeah,
a woman, so you should be doing this along these pathways,
absolutely. Yeah,
or you're a man, so you should be behaving and only walking these kind of pathways, or those kinds of things, breaking down all those
yeah,
societal walls of what we should
yeah,
do.
absolutely.
Hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that often means that you can bring more of an element of fun to things, right? Like work is not always fun 24 hours a day, every day, but there's no rule that says that you can't have fun in your work, right?
Hmm. I
Mm.
agree. I'd like to
Yeah,
have.
I think there are a lot of genuine limitations and constraints that are put on us. And so I do think it would be a bit of a tragedy if we heaped extra constraints and limitations on us, on ourselves, that weren't actually there.
Hmm. So as we round up this chat,
Mhm.
what do you think is the need of the times and how are you supporting that?
Oh, that's another big question. I think one of the big needs of the times is, we talk a lot about people being trapped in silos and not
Mm.
talking across those silos. But I think one of the things that is increasingly a challenge is to help people find a space where they can not be fixed in their own ideas, where they can develop their own ideas over time. And I think for me, when I look back on growing up before social media, one of the big blessings of that, and social media has its absolute positives, but I think that one of the things that growing up before social media let all of us do is it let those people in my generation, and probably yours, have opinions and views that we grew out of, that we evolved out of. And so I think at our best, we need to have the space where we think, and we might say, look, this is what I think is true and real and valuable today, but I might change my mind. And I have some kind of toolkit for knowing on what basis I'll change my mind. But I do have the space that I'm not locked into something that I said or thought 10 years ago. And I think, for some of us, I think back to that undergraduate student who said, yeah, she really changed my mind. But for him, that was the space just to do it. I thought this 25 minutes ago. I've now thought about it in more depth and I've changed my mind. And I think that is particularly courageous, but it's also just the stuff of life, right? If we take seriously that idea that we get better morally and ethically over time, that we develop our characters over time, um, it's undeniable that we start from a place where we're doing the best we can and then we improve over time. So I think we do need space to play out that. Evolution's such a loaded word these days, but that kind of personal improvement and personal evolution. So we don't kind of dig in and have to defend a position because we tweeted something 5 years ago. And I think, and I think that's something we all need to find a space for ourselves. And I hope that that's the kind of thing that will allow us to talk across silos, right? It's kind of the necessary precondition for that, I think.
Yeah, so we're sitting in the evolution of self to have the psychological flexibility to shift and change as is needed and warranted according to what we learn over time.
Yeah, I think that's right. I was talking with someone in another discipline a few months ago, and we were talking about, look, what does it mean to do ethics well, to think about ethics well, and to improve our own thinking there? And she said something which really struck me. She said, "Oh, I would never tell someone that they're wrong." And that was one of the first times that it really landed for me that what philosophical ethics, what philosophy does at its best is help each of us examine our own thinking. And the only person that I'm telling is wrong is myself of 5 minutes ago, right? It's about improving and reflecting on my own thinking. And sometimes we do that together, but we each individually improve and evolve our own thinking. We just need space to do that, I think.
Yeah, I could add to that if I could. The
Please.
and this might also be just the psychologist that I am coming to bear again. I think the more we understand the ways that our thinking is influenced and the ways that we make decisions, that psychology part of us that's at play all the time,
Mm,
then that's helping us to understand ourselves more, and then we're able to be understanding, oh, that happened just now. I've thought that and I know why. Whereas once upon a time I may have thought, I don't know why I'm thinking that. I read this and that, but I've made this decision and I don't understand why my thinking is like that or why I'm influenced in that way. And I like the idea that people can understand through the research that we do about humans, how they activated in the world. And then that can help them understand that maybe there is a different way, and maybe this is how I'm being influenced, or even check in and then follow in what you're saying about, why is it how I'm thinking like this, and how might it be different? And say, well, I came here because this is how I kind of naturally went. Now I understand that I can be different. Um, and you can take a different course of thinking even.
Oh, I absolutely love that answer. And I think, what it reminds me of is, really the foundational start of Western philosophy, as well as how should one live. It's self-knowledge, right? It's know thyself. And I think there is such a freedom and such a self-empowerment that comes from that self-knowledge and being able to change your views when new evidence comes in or new thinking comes in, um, so that you're not just reacting to things, but you actually are able to act in a way that is true to your own intellectual agency, is true to, I suppose, the higher goods of what you're trying to achieve. But there is an empowerment and a freedom that comes from being able to do that. And I think, lastly, without drawing too tight a connection, that's something that we're always thinking about when I'm thinking about something like professional ethics, that it's important to have codes of professional ethics. But the really clear thing that intellectual agency gives you is an understanding of why certain rules are in the codes of professional ethics, a sense of, do I, with my own intellectual agency, endorse them? Have I come to be convinced that they are good ethical standards, so they're not just arbitrary rules that I'm following? And what is it to come across a situation where it's not clear to me how the professional guidelines apply to that? How do I navigate that? There's a real sense of um, freedom and autonomy that comes from that intellectual agency, so that I'm a thinking person who's endorsing that code of ethics rather than just arbitrarily being bound by it.
Lovely. That's, that could lead us into a whole other conversation for another hour.
Good.
So
It could, yeah.
I go, oh, I want to ask about this and that. So we may have another call, so we'll see. But we'll finish up here. It's your going into your evening, afternoon, evening, and continuing on into my day. So thank you so much for a brilliant chat. I absolutely loved it.
Thank you so much. That was just an absolute delight. That really made me think about some really profound stuff. So I'm going to be spending the rest of my evening thinking about that. So thank you so much. It's really generous.